The crystal goblets caught the candlelight like tiny jars of captured fireflies, each flame bending and trembling inside the glass. Crimson wine swirled lazily as 12 members of the Whitmore family lifted their cups for grace. In that shimmering pause before the first sip, no one at the table knew that within minutes, their laughter would turn to choking silence. This is the quiet, terrible story of how one enslaved woman brought an entire Mississippi plantation to its knees, armed with nothing more than patience, a pinch of arsenic, and a simple kitchen ladle. Imagine the scene. Clara stands in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, hands folded neatly over her apron, the posture of obedience she has worn for 11 long years. She watches as the Whitmore family settles into their evening meal on a humid August night in 1847. The grandfather clock in the parlor begins to chime. 7 slow, deliberate notes slide into the heavy Mississippi air, like the toll of a funeral bell. The scent of roasted duck mingles with the sweetness of magnolia drifting through the open windows. And beneath it, all so faint that only a sharpened heart could sense, it lurks something metallic and cold. A whisper of arsenic that no one at the table can yet taste. Before we slip deeper into this shadowed chapter of American history, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Is it already dark outside your window, or are you still chasing the last traces of daylight? Let me know in the comments when you wake again. And if stories like this hold you the way candlelight holds the darkness, tap that like button and join us. Because what you are about to hear was buried in courthouse records for over a century. The Whitmore plantation spread like a green ocean across 3,000 acres of cotton fields just outside Natchez, where the Mississippi River curved against the land like a serpent's spine. Judge Cornelius Whitmore ruled this empire with the same iron grip he carried into the courtroom. His wife, Margaret, managed a household of 47 enslaved people with what she liked to call Christian firmness. Their 4 grown children had all returned home for the judge's 62nd birthday celebration, bringing spouses, grandchildren, and the easy laughter of a family certain of its own future. Laughter that would soon dissolve into screams. Clara had been purchased at a New Orleans auction 11 years earlier. She was torn from her 2 young daughters that day. Little girls sold away to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. Clara never saw them again. In the Whitmore kitchen, she became invisible, a pair of quiet, capable hands that stirred pots, kneaded bread, and seasoned meals with the flawless instinct that made the judge boast to his colleagues that his table was the finest in all of Adams County. "Pass the duck, would you?" Margaret Whitmore asked her eldest son, not noticing the way Clara's dark eyes followed every movement from her post by the door. The arsenic had been almost laughably easy to obtain. Sold as rat poison in the general store, it raised no suspicion when a black woman purchased it. The big house always had rats. Clara had been gathering small amounts for 3 patient months, tucking each pinch into a hollow gourd hidden behind sacks of flour. She knew the measurements as if she was seasoning a soup, just enough to kill, not so much that a bitter taste would give away the first bite. At the table, 6-year-old Emma, the youngest grandchild, wrinkled her nose and nudged her vegetables with her fork. "These taste funny, grandmother," she whispered. "Nonsense," Margaret replied, smiling with a matron's confidence. "Clean your plate. Clara's cooking is above reproach." The horrible poetry of it all. Clara had folded the poison into the wine reduction, spooned over the duck, whisked it into the cream sauce that coated the vegetables, even sifted a final deadly dusting over the birthday cake waiting in the kitchen. Every dish that touched their lips carried death like a secret seasoning. The family continued their cheerful talk of cotton prices and upcoming social visits, never sensing that their fate was crystallizing in their bloodstreams with every swallow. Judge Whitmore raised his glass for a third toast, his voice already beginning to slur, though he blamed the wine. To family, he declared. To prosperity. To the natural order of things. From the doorway, Clara's fingers tightened on the wooden frame. By 7:45, little Emma suddenly leaned forward and vomited across the white tablecloth. Her mother rushed to her side but felt her own knees weaken beneath her. The judge tried to rise, his face purpling as his hands clawed at his throat. One by one, like dominoes falling in a grotesque game, the Whitmore family began to convulse. The food, someone gasped. "We've been poisoned." Eyes turned toward the kitchen doorway. But Clara was no longer there. The dining room dissolved into chaos, chairs, scraping crystal, shattering bodies, collapsing to the floor as the grandfather clock ticked on steady and indifferent. Somewhere in the humid Mississippi night, magnolia petals drifted to the ground, carrying the faint metallic scent of justice no one had dared to speak aloud. The youngest Whitmore son clawed at the polished floor, his body dragging itself toward the open doorway, as though freedom might still be waiting beyond it. He made it only a few inches before his limbs gave out, his cheek pressed against the cool wood. Margaret Whitmore, matron of the house, still had enough breath left to shape a single word, though foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. Clara. The name rang through the great hall like a cracked church bell, half accusation, half realization. But the courthouse records, yellowed and brittle, never captured the rest of the house that night. They don't tell of the other souls who listened. The footmen who might have sprinted for the doctor, but instead walked with deliberate slowness, their steps a quiet refusal. The housemaids who heard the first screams, but folded the last pieces of laundry before even glancing toward the dining room. The stable boy who watched Clara slip into the moonlight with a small bundle under her arm, heading toward the river's dark shimmer, and said nothing until morning. What would you have done, standing in that doorway, watching the captors of your own life writhing in their own last agony? Would you have rushed forward with a basin of water? Or would you have disappeared into the night, like smoke carrying silence as your only weapon? 12 people sat down to supper at the Whitmore Plantation on August 18th, 1847. By the next sunrise, the great house stood as silent as a tomb, and Clara was already 20 miles downriver, following the invisible map of the Underground Railroad, a path she had purchased with arsenic patience and a rage sharpened over 11 lonely years. But the story does not end with empty chairs and cold soup. By 8:15, the Whitmore dining room had transformed into something between a sick room and a battlefield where the enemy was invisible and victory meant only the next breath. Judge Cornelius Whitmore had collapsed face first into the birthday cake that once symbolized his power, now nothing more than a cushion for the dying. The true horror of arsenic is not the swiftness of death, it is the waiting. Inside the grand house, 12 members of the Whitmore family twisted and convulsed in various stages of agony, their suffering rising and falling like the movements of a dreadful symphony. The grandfather clock continued its steady count, each tick marking another step downward, as if the house itself were keeping time for their descent. The perfume of magnolia, drifting through the windows, had been replaced by the acrid stench of vomit, sweat, and fear. The polished oak floors grew slick with perspiration, and worse. Through the tall windows, the lamplight of the quarters flickered gently. Yet, no footsteps came running. No cry for help crossed the humid night. Dr. Edmund Hayes, only 3 miles away, sat unaware his medical bag still closed his horse, still unsaddled. The messenger who should have fetched him, a young enslaved man named Thomas, stood frozen in the main hallway, watching as Judge Whitmore crawled across Persian rugs that had cost more than Thomas could earn in 10 lifetimes. From Thomas's diary, written 40 years later, we find only a single aching confession. August 18th, 1847. I could have run for the doctor. God knows I could have. But I thought of my sister sold away when the judge needed quick money. I stood there and I watched Margaret Whitmore, even as the fire of poison scorched its way through her organs, managed to drag herself to the silver bell used to summon servants. She rang it frantically, the clear, sharp notes slicing through the chaos like a scream. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers heard it perfectly. They looked at one another, an entire conversation flashing in their eyes, and then wordlessly, they turned back to the dishes. The water continued to splash against porcelain. No one moved. The youngest grandchild, little Emma, was the first to slip away. Her small body could not fight the poison coursing through her veins. Her mother, Rachel Whitmore, clutched the lifeless child against her chest and wailed a sound so raw it seemed to tear through the walls themselves. Why she screamed to the heavens, to the servants, to anyone who might hear. She was innocent, but innocence, Clara knew, even as she moved farther downriver, had never protected enslaved children from being sold beaten or worked to death. Judge Whitmore's son James, a lawyer from Jackson, who had inherited both his father's sharp jawline and his cruelty, tried to take command even as his own body betrayed him. Block the roads, he gasped to no one in particular. Find that woman. There will be hell to pay. His words crumbled into silence, swallowed by the relentless ticking of the clock. The house, once a monument to wealth and order, was now only a stage where justice, slow, deliberate and merciless, played out to its final note. From the slave quarters, the night carried strange music. The field hands heard at first retching screams, the crash of overturned furniture echoing across the humid dark. Some quietly pulled their thin door shut and clutched their children, close hearts pounding like drums of warning. Others remained on their porches, silent witnesses to a justice they had never dared to dream might come. Old Moses, who had lost 3 fingers to the judge's temper years ago, allowed himself the smallest, quietest smile. Meanwhile, Clara moved steadily along the swamp paths she had memorized during 11 long years of bondage. Every full moon spent gathering herbs for the kitchen had been more than chores, it was reconnaissance. Tonight, the hidden trails unfolded beneath her feet like an old friend. In her bundle, she carried a change of clothes, 37 stolen dollars, carefully lifted from Margaret's drawer over the years, and forged papers naming her a free woman called Sarah Coleman. Each item had been prepared with the same precision as the poison now working its way through the veins of her captors. Back in the dining room, Judge Whitmore fought through waves of agony to a single chilling moment of clarity. His bloodshot eyes locked on the portrait of his father above the mantel, another plantation owner who 2 decades earlier had died suddenly at dinner. A cold realization slithered through him. Had that been murder too? How many meals in this house had been seasoned with revenge? The children Margaret wheezed her hand groping blindly for her grown sons even as her vision swam. Save the children. But there would be no saving tonight? No frantic ride for a doctor? No desperate remedy at the last minute. The arsenic moved with clinical precision, shutting down organs one by one exactly as Clara had planned. She had learned everything by listening to Dr. Hayes during his visits, pretending to dust while memorizing his words about dosage and symptoms. She had tested tiny amounts on the plantation dogs, quietly timing their deaths and adjusting her calculations. This was not impulse. This was engineering. By 9 o'clock, half the family had slipped into unconsciousness. The others remained painfully aware, forced to watch their loved ones fade while knowing their own turn was coming. James Whitmore, the sharp-jawed lawyer who had inherited his father's cruelty, used his last minutes to scrawl a trembling message on a linen napkin. Clara did this, as if anyone would need the confirmation. But here is where the story bends in ways the court documents never mention. In the quarters, Clara's closest friend Ruth whispered to the others that Clara had intended only to poison the judge. The birthday supper with the entire family gathered around the table had not been part of the original plan. Something had changed that very morning. Something no one could name that convinced Clara one death would not be enough. Inside the great house, voices failed one by one. The cries softened to ragged breathing, then to low moans. The candles guttered and burned lower, throwing restless shadows across the walls, making the dying appear to move even when they had gone still. Outside, a mockingbird began its midnight performance, cycling through stolen songs. Inside, a different kind of theft unfolded. Lives for lives, a family for a family. By 10 o'clock, only Margaret still clung to the edge of consciousness, her fingers wrapped around her husband's cooling hand. In her delirium, she whispered apologies not to God, but to someone named Bessie. A housemaid, listening from the hallway, stiffened at the name. Bessie had been an enslaved woman who died in childbirth after the judge refused to call a doctor, dismissing her life as too costly. Margaret's final prayer was not for salvation but for the ghost she had helped condemn. The last sound Margaret heard was not a hymn, nor a child's cry, but the slow creak of footsteps as the household staff finally entered the dining room. They did not rush to help. They stood in a half-circle around the table, silent as ghosts, their faces unreadable. There was no triumph there, no pity either, only the steady weight of memory carved into stone. At 11:47 p.m., 12 members of the Whitmore family lay dead in their finery, the birthday cake still adorned with unlit candles. The grand house sank into a silence so deep you could hear the Spanish moss brushing against the windows like a whisper from the past. And somewhere in the dark stretch of river between Mississippi and Freedom, Clara paused at a creek to wash the flour from beneath her fingernails. The cold water carried away the last traces of kitchen life, leaving her hands as clean as the moonlight above. But the story did not end with Clara's escape. The enslaved men and women she left behind would face questions investigations, and punishments that rippled through Adams County like waves from a stone dropped into still water. When dawn finally broke over the Whitmore plantation, it arrived like a held breath released. Sunlight streamed through tall windows to reveal 12 lifeless bodies arranged around a dining table. An eerie still life of wealth and ruin. Would you have stepped forward to speak or like the witnesses of that night? Would you have remained silent, letting the morning light fall on justice that no one dared name? The birthday candles had burned down into waxy puddles, their small flames long gone, but their scent still clung faintly to the heavy air. What happens to a plantation when every white soul in the house dies in a single night? It's a question worth lingering on, isn't it? The roosters crowed at 5:30 a.m. as they always did, utterly indifferent to the carnage that had unfolded inside the grand Whitmore house. The morning air smelled of honeysuckle and death. Dewdrops gathered on spiderwebs stretched across the porch railings like nature's own crime scene tape. The world outside carried on, but inside silence pressed against the walls like a held breath. In the slave quarters, 47 enslaved men and women faced a decision that could change every heartbeat of their futures. Report the deaths and face the cruel machinery of interrogation, or seize this once-in-a-lifetime opening to carve a path toward freedom. Imagine standing in that moment. Would you dare to reach for liberty, knowing discovery could mean the rope? Ruth, Clara's closest friend, moved first. For 15 long years, she had served as the Whitmore's head housemaid, trusted with keys to every door except the judge's private study. Now, in the grey hush of dawn, she stood inside that forbidden sanctuary, her hands trembling as she rifled through papers. Land deeds, bills of sale, contracts including her own where her body and skills were coldly valued at $800 as though she were a fine horse or a prized piece of furniture. "Burn it all," whispered Samuel the blacksmith, his deep voice barely more than a breath. "Tell them bandits came in the night." But old Moses, leaning on his cane with a 3-fingered hand, slowly shook his head. "You think they'll believe bandits poisoned a family at dinner? They'll hang every last one of us before asking a single question." The debate rose and fell in urgent hushed tones, while upstairs, flies had already discovered the feast of death. By 7 o'clock, a field hand named Jupiter was chosen to ride for the neighboring Turner plantation with grim news. The story was set. The Whitmore family had fallen violently ill during dinner. Despite the servants' desperate efforts, all had perished from what appeared to be tainted food. And Clara, sweet clever Clara, was not to be mentioned. As far as the world knew, she had been sold 2 weeks earlier to a plantation in Georgia. From the records of the Adams County Courthouse, August 19, 1847, the paper trail seemed neat and tidy. Witness statements confirmed the cook Clara had been transferred to the Belmont estate on August 5th. A bill of sale was produced by the surviving household staff. "Investigation ongoing," the clerk wrote, in careful script. But that document was a masterpiece of deception. Forged by Ruth herself, the ink mixed fresh that morning, aged with coffee grounds and a touch of smoke. She had practiced the owner's signature 100 times in secret, each stroke a small act of rebellion. Clara had taught her to read and write by candlelight, risking the lash for every letter learned. Every word on that false paper carried the weight of those secret lessons. At precisely 9:43 a.m., Sheriff William Donovan arrived with the county coroner Dr. Marcus Webb. They found a scene of orchestrated chaos, servants weeping over their dead masters, others scrubbing at stains that would never come clean. Ruth met them at the door, her eyes red from tears, or perhaps from onion juice discreetly rubbed into the corners. "It happened so fast, Sheriff," she sobbed, voice quivering like a violin string. One moment they were celebrating, and the next, her hand fluttered helplessly toward the silent dining room. Dr. Webb, a meticulous man trained in Philadelphia, knelt beside the bodies. He noted the cherry-red flush of the skin, the pinprick pupils, the foam drying at the corners of mouths. His conclusion came quickly and without doubt: arsenic poisoning, and not a small amount, enough to require pounds of the deadly substance. "Who prepared the meal?" asked the sheriff, though his eyes already rested on Ruth. "We all did," she answered smoothly, a half-truth wrapped in iron loyalty. "Clara made the sauces before she left, but I finished the cooking. Samuel carved the duck. Letty prepared the vegetables. If the food was tainted, we all touched it. Brilliant. Spread the blame so thin it dissolved like sugar in tea." The sheriff prowled the kitchen, but the room gleamed spotless. The enslaved workers had scrubbed through the night, erasing every trace of preparation. The pantry held only ordinary ingredients. The rat poison sat untouched, the amount inside matching a receipt from 6 months earlier. But Dr. Webb's sharp eyes caught a detail the others missed: a single magnolia petal on the kitchen floor. Magnolia trees grew only by the river path far from the kitchen door. Someone had been outside during the night walking where they had no reason to be. "Search the grounds," the sheriff ordered. Every cabin, every outbuilding. They found only what they expected: corn husk mattresses, patched clothing, a few hidden coins. But the true absence told the louder story. No letters, no books, no trace of the secret school Clara had run for 3 daring years, teaching others to read by copying Bible verses in the dark. Those precious scraps of paper had been burned hours earlier, their ashes scattered in the vegetable garden under a moonless sky. By noon, news rippled across Adams County. White families locked their doors and watched their servants with fresh suspicion. Some dismissed their cooks outright, preferring hunger to fear. The Turner household forced their enslaved workers to taste every dish before serving, turning each meal into a cruel ritual of poison testing. Meanwhile, Clara rode hidden in plain sight, seated atop a lumber wagon, bound for Louisiana. The driver, Josiah, was a free black man and a trusted link in the Underground Railroad, a network of silent prayers stitched across the Deep South. Clara traveled as Sarah Coleman, a seamstress visiting family in Baton Rouge. Her forged papers held up under casual inspection, while beneath the wagon boards, 3 other runaways lay concealed in narrow compartments. Can you picture her heart racing with every creak of the wheels, every glance from a passing rider? Back at the Whitmore estate, the investigation deepened. A judge from Jackson arrived to untangle the legal snarl. With every white heir dead and no master to claim ownership, the plantation and the 47 enslaved people who lived upon it existed in a terrifying limbo. Still property but belonging to no one. Sheriff Donovan questioned each worker separately, searching for cracks in their story. But the narrative Ruth had woven held firm. Clara had been sold. The family had eaten as always. And the truth, the dangerous, liberating truth, remained safely buried beneath onion tears, burnt paper, and the soft whisper of magnolia petals. Would you have taken that chance if freedom meant living forever behind a carefully built lie? Or would the fear of the rope have kept you silent? The Whitmore mystery lingers like the scent of honeysuckle on a humid morning, a story of courage cunning, and the quiet footsteps of those who chose the long road to liberty while the world slept. The sickness came suddenly like a shadow that slipped in unnoticed. When Sheriff Donovan pressed Ruth again about Clara's supposed whereabouts in Georgia, Ruth reached for the weapon she had forged in secret over the past 2 weeks, letters written in Clara's careful hand, their ink barely dry, but aged with a little smoke to mimic time. She writes that the Belmont family treats her well. Ruth murmured, eyes lowered. Says she misses her friends here but accepts God's will. God's will. Wrapped in arsenic. The sheriff's fingers lingered on the paper, but he did not yet see the trap within the words. That same afternoon, Dr. Marcus Webb began his autopsies. The coroner's scalpel revealed what the eye already suspected: every victim carried massive doses of arsenic, enough to silence a dozen lives with clinical precision. This was no accident. This was deliberate murder. But the supposed culprit, Clara, had already been sold to a plantation hundreds of miles away. With no witnesses willing to break the wall of silence, the investigation shuddered and stalled like a wagon mired in mud. As the sun dipped low and the Whitmore bodies were prepared for burial, the enslaved community gathered in their quarters for prayer. But between the soft hymns and the whispered amens, their eyes met in silent exchange. They had survived the first day of questioning. Now came the harder test, holding the story steady as rewards were offered, as pressure tightened like a rope around the neck. Old Moses led the prayer, his 3-fingered hand lifted toward a sky already blushing with evening. Lord, he intoned, we pray for the souls of the departed. May they find the peace in death they denied others in life. Amen, came the low, unified reply. The sound drifted across the cotton fields where come morning they would return to labor as though nothing had changed, while lawyers far away argued over who would own their lives next. But change was already moving toward them. Sheriff Donovan had just received a telegram from Georgia. Its single sentence cracked the fragile lie like lightning through a dry tree. No Belmont plantation exists, never has. Donovan's boots struck the Whitmore kitchen floor like a judge's gavel as he entered the telegram clenched in his fist. There is no Belmont plantation, he barked. Never has been. You've all been lying to me. The morning sun slanted through the windows, casting prison bar shadows across the worn floorboards, where 6 enslaved workers now stood in a tight line. Their carefully woven story was beginning to crumble like old parchment. Behind Ruth, Samuel's breathing grew rugged. Letty trembled beside him. Fear rolled off them in waves thick as Mississippi humidity. Now Donovan said, lowering his voice to a near whisper, a sound more chilling than any shout. Let's discuss what really happened to Clara. 20 miles away, Clara, now Sarah Coleman, sat quietly in the colored section of a steamboat, pushing up the Mississippi River. The ticket collector barely glanced at her papers, distracted by a white woman loudly complaining about her cabin. Clara kept her head bowed, fingers wrapped around a rosary she had never used before playing the part of a devout freedwoman on her way to Memphis for church work. Each mile of river carried her farther from the gallows. From the pages of the New Orleans Daily, Picayune, August 21, 1847, 12 dead in Adams County. Entire plantation family poisoned. Negro cook suspected. Reward offered for information leading to capture. The ink of the headline was barely dry when the notice reached Sheriff Donovan. Back in the Whitmore kitchen, Ruth weighed her next move with the precision of a knife's edge. She let tears pool in her eyes, real ones this time, thinking of Clara's daughters who had been sold away. Clara. She'd been acting strange since her girls were taken. Ruth whispered, her voice trembling just enough. She said she had a cousin in Georgia who could help her find work. We helped her leave because we feared what she might do if she stayed. 2 weeks ago, she reminded Donovan softly, just as they had all said before. The sheriff studied their faces one by one, searching for the flicker of a lie. But these were people who had survived by hiding thoughts behind still eyes, by swallowing truths so deep they became invisible. They gave him nothing. Meanwhile, outside the Whitmore gates, the vultures of law and inheritance circled. Distant cousins arrived from 3 states away, their eyes gleaming with the scent of profit. Lawyers rolled up in carriages calculating the worth of land cotton and human lives with the same cold precision. The 47 enslaved men and women were appraised like furniture while their future remained suspended in legal limbo. That afternoon, Donovan ordered something unprecedented. A massive manhunt. Riders were dispatched to every major road, every river, crossing every railway station within 100 miles. Clara's description: Negro woman, approximately 30 years of age, 5 foot 4 inches, small scar on left hand from kitchen burn, was posted in every town square, from Natchez to New Orleans. But Clara had prepared for this moment. Before leaving, she had rubbed a pale ash solution into her skin to lighten her complexion, just enough to blur recognition. She had restyled her hair and padded her clothing to appear heavier. And the telltale scar on her left hand, hidden beneath fine kid leather gloves stolen from Margaret Whitmore's drawer. Gloves elegant enough to suggest a woman of means rather than a hunted cook. The hunt grew even more frenzied when investigators uncovered something buried deep within Clara's abandoned cabin. A small journal, its pages scrawled in a crude but deliberate code. Dr. Webb locked himself away with the book, working for hours to untangle the cipher. At last, the hidden text emerged, not recipes for food but for poison. Page after page detailed mixtures, dosage calculations, and most chilling of all, a careful list of names with dates marked beside them. My God! Dr. Webb whispered the words barely audible in the heavy stillness. What names had Clara chosen to carry with her into freedom, and which had she left behind inked in silence? Would you have had her courage to write your vengeance in code and carry it across the river? Or would the fear of capture have frozen your every step? The Mississippi kept moving, and so did Clara her story, drifting farther away even as the noose tightened behind her. The Whitmore family, it turned out, had never been Clara's first. In the hidden pages of her coded journal, 3 other names rose above the Whitmores like ghosts refusing to stay buried. The Hendersons in 1843, the patriarch dead of a mysterious stomach ailment. The Beauregards in 1845, 2 sons felled by whiskey that burned like fire and poison. The Lancasters in 1846, mother and daughter gone within days to a fever that never matched the season. and in the records of each household, a single constant appeared like a watermark: Clara. Soul transferred, hired out between families, as though she were nothing more than a kitchen utensil, passed from one table to the next. Her movements had once seemed like the random shuffle of human property. Now the pattern emerged with terrible clarity. She entered a house, quietly earned trust like a shadow that learned the layout of every room, and when the moment ripened, she struck. The Whitmores were not an accident. They were her masterpiece. Her final statement before stepping into the river of history and disappearing. Bodies were exhumed. Samples were tested. Arsenic glittered in the tissues of every victim, a cold, metallic proof of intention. The revelation detonated through Mississippi society like a cannon blast. If Clara could do this, how many others might be plotting the same? How many trusted cooks stood silently over pots and pans while their masters slept, waiting for the right night, the right dose? Paranoia spread faster than yellow fever. Kitchen doors were bolted from the outside. Food tasters were hired. Some families dismissed entire staffs overnight, choosing hunger over the invisible terror of a servant's revenge. Far from the panic, Clara sat on a riverboat, listening as white passengers discussed the murders with horrified fascination. A woman in silk declared she could no longer trust the cook who had raised her from infancy. A merchant suggested chaining every house servant at night. A minister thundered that such crimes proved the African race incapable of Christian mercy. Clara said nothing. She merely fingered the small vial of arsenic still hidden in her bodice, a final measure in case capture became unavoidable. Better to die free than to live enslaved. By the fourth day, the manhunt stretched across state lines. The reward rose to an astonishing $2,000. Professional slave catchers, men who could track a runaway across Waterstone and fear itself, joined the chase. They brought dogs trained on scraps of clothing from Clara's cabin. But Ruth, ever the strategist, had already contaminated those garments with pepper and turpentine, dulling the hound's senses before the hunt began. Even so, Clara's true protection lay not in clever diversions, but in the quiet power of a hidden network. The Underground Railroad had been preparing for her passage for months. At every stop, strangers risked their lives for a woman they might never meet again. A minister in Baton Rouge, a shopkeeper in Memphis, a farmer outside Nashville. Each passed her like a whispered prayer. No questions asked, no judgment, given only the shared belief that freedom was worth any danger. One close call came at the Tennessee border. A slave catcher named Briggs traced her to a safe house and arrived just hours too late. He found only an elderly free black woman named Aunt Cora sitting by a dying fire. "You're lying?" Briggs growled, certain Clara had been there. Cora smiled faintly. "Sir, I'm 73 years old," she said, her voice steady. "What would I want with harboring fugitives I can barely harbor my own bones?" Briggs left empty-handed, never noticing the fresh wagon tracks leading north or the tremor in Cora's hands once the door closed. Back at the Whitmore plantation, the pressure on the enslaved community tightened like a vice. The estate lawyers hired a new overseer, a cruel man named Patterson, whose reputation rested on breaking spirits until the truth bled out. He began with the youngest children, demanding to know what Clara had said, where she might run, who had helped her. But the children had been schooled in silence. They shrugged, eyes blank. She kept to herself, they said. always muttering about her lost daughters. One boy, no more than 8, looked Patterson directly in the eye and offered a line Ruth had carefully planted. She told me once poison was sweeter than sugar. If you knew how to serve it right. The room froze. Then Patterson barked a laugh. Children and their stories. The boy's gamble worked the truth hidden inside a jest. 3 states away. Clara finally reached a station in Ohio where she could breathe without calculating every sound. The safe house belonged to a family of Quakers who asked for nothing but her first name. Not Clara, not Sarah, but the name her mother had whispered over her in a language stolen by chains. Adoni, she said softly, beloved. The syllables felt strange and sacred on her tongue. Her true name returned, after 30 years of silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life measured not by escapes, but by mournings. But freedom remained a fragile thing. Back in Mississippi, Sheriff Donovan spread 4 maps across the courthouse table, each marked with a red X for every family that had died. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 tiny gavels. In the flicker of lamplight, a revelation surfaced. The killings were not random. A single line connected each household, marching steadily northeast. She's not running blind, Donovan said at last, voice heavy with reluctant admiration. She's heading somewhere specific. Dr. Marcus Webb leaned in, tracing the line with a surgeon's precision. Look at the names, he murmured. Henderson sold slaves to Beauregard. Beauregard's daughter married a Lancaster. And Margaret Whitmore, her maiden name, was Henderson. He pulled a yellowed ledger from the pile, its edges curled from years of damp. Inside lay a bill of sale, dated 1836. A transaction for one Negro woman aged 19 called Clara and 2 female children ages 3 and 5. The seller, Henderson Plantation. The buyers assorted families at the New Orleans slave market. Donovan stared at the brittle page, the ink dark as judgment. Dear God, he whispered. She's hunting the families who sold her daughters. Meanwhile, far to the north, Clara still traveling, as Sarah Coleman sat in the back pew of a small AME church outside Cincinnati. The congregation swayed to a hymn about Moses, leading his people out of bondage voices, rising like a tide that carried centuries of sorrow. Clara clutched the rosary she had once taken as a disguise, but now held with something close to faith. After the service, the minister's wife, Elizabeth Harper, approached with gentle curiosity. Sister Sarah, you seem troubled. Clara knew how to braid truth and invention until they became indistinguishable. I'm searching for my daughters, she said, letting her voice tremble. They were taken from me years ago. I was told they might have gone north. Mrs. Harper's eyes softened with the ache of shared experience. What were their names? Patience and Grace. The names left Clara's lips like prayers dipped in poison. They'd be 18 and 20 now. I heard they were sold to a family heading toward Canada. What Clara did not reveal was that she had already traced their first steps. Grace sold to the Lancasters. Patience to the Beauregards. Both girls resold within a year, vanished into the endless paper trail of human commerce. But Clara had made their first purchasers pay. One household at a time. Back in Mississippi, the investigation took on the urgency of a holy crusade. Plantation owners across 3 states demanded swift justice, their fear masked as righteous outrage. Each courtroom whisper carried the same unspoken question. If Clara could plan such vengeance in silence for years, How many others were waiting quiet and patient for their own night of reckoning? Would you have seen the pattern in time? Or would you like those powerful families have sat down to dinner, never tasting the poison until it was far too late? The governor's words spread like a sickness of their own. A woman, an enslaved cook, was now declared a threat to the very foundation of civilized society. $5,000. That was the price placed on Clara's capture. More than most white men would ever see in a lifetime, and far more than any enslaved soul could even dream of touching. Money like that did strange things to people. It sharpened eyes, loosened tongues, and turned neighbors into hunters. Can you hear the rustle of wanted posters against courthouse doors? The ink, still wet, as fear and greed set the paper trembling in the Mississippi breeze. Back at the Whitmore plantation, terror had been turned into policy. Patterson, the new overseer sent by estate lawyers, wasted no time building a kingdom of cruelty. He questioned every enslaved person every single day. Meals were withheld when answers faltered. Children were pulled from their mother's arms until anyone spoke. And yet, no one broke. The silence inside those quarters was not weakness. It was a fortress. It was a promise kept in whispers and glances. It was survival woven into a single unbroken thread. But even fortresses have cracks. It was old Moses, 71 years old, who finally gave them something, though not quite what they wanted. Not torture exhaustion. 5 days without proper food, and in the half-dream of hunger, he muttered 2 words that Patterson seized upon, like a starving hawk the teaching tree. Dragged awake beneath the burning lantern light, Moses confessed with a trembling 3-fingered hand. She taught letters, he said, under the big oak. Said knowing words was knowing power. Imagine the shiver that ran through white Mississippi that night. A literate slave one who could read recipes, calculate dosages, forge papers. Clara was no mere cook. She was a mind at war. Orders flew across counties, check every enslaved person for literacy. Punish those who could read. Sell those who could write. Knowledge had become contraband, but Clara had prepared them for this moment long before the poison ever touched a cup. Give them old truths, she had told them. Truths that lead nowhere, but sound like somewhere. And so, the teaching tree, burned the very night of the murders, became a perfect dead end. Meanwhile, Sheriff Donovan's map was coming alive with patterns. Each red X marked a death. Each line connecting those X's pointed northeast toward Tennessee, toward Ohio, toward the faint promise of Canada. If she's following her daughters, Donovan muttered, she'll take the routes the runaways use. Telegraphs crackled across the country. Every city along the Underground Railroad was warned. She has a 3-week head start, Donovan ordered, but someone will have seen her. But Clara was already ghosts ahead. In Cincinnati, she shed the skin of Sarah Coleman, the way a snake leaves behind an empty coil. Gone was the fine dress, the gloves stolen from Margaret Whitmore's drawer. Her hair was different. The lie that once lightened her skin had faded. Her padded figure slimmed. She became invisible in a new way, not as a servant, but as just another freed woman, fighting for a slice of survival in a city that protected its own. Yet survival alone no longer filled her heart. In the quiet of her rented attic room, Clara unfolded a worn fragment of a letter. It spoke of 2 young women in Ontario, teachers at a school for black children. Their names were different, but the ages matched. One with careful hands, the other with a singing voice that could make angels weep. Grace and Patience. Her daughters. Her babies. Clara closed her eyes and remembered every detail only a mother would keep alive. Grace's crooked left, Pinky Patience's crescent-shaped birthmark behind the ear. Those memories beat inside her like a second heart. At the boarding house where she worked, she listened to travelers chatter, collecting crumbs of rumor about anyone heading to Canada. Every word might be a bridge, every silence a trap. Slowly she traced a new path north, each stop a careful move on a deadly chessboard. But far to the south, another kind of mind was working. Dr. Webb, still studying the coded journal in Mississippi, noticed something others had overlooked. The peculiar way Clara curled the letter G. He'd seen that same flourish on kitchen inventories, on laundry lists, on the forged bill of sale itself. She can change her face, Webb telegraphed to Donovan, but she cannot change her hand. The trap tightened. Boarding houses, churches, print shops, every place where ink met paper was searched for that telltale G. And Clara, desperate for a thread to her daughters, made the one mistake she had sworn never to make. She wrote a letter, a simple inquiry to a school in Ontario. Just a mother searching for children. But the curl of that single G betrayed her. The letter never reached Canada. It was intercepted, read, and carried like a trophy to the men who hunted her. The knock came at 4:17 a.m. Sharp, deliberate. The kind of sound that pulls you from the deepest sleep and sets every nerve alight. Clara woke instantly, her hand finding the small glass vial in the dark before her feet found the floor. Outside her door, the scrape of boots on wood, the low rumble of men's voices. Freedom, she thought, always sounds like footsteps in the dark. Rain lashed against the windows of the boarding house on Elm Street in Cincinnati's Bucktown district, a neighborhood where free blacks and the newly escaped blended into a silence that had learned to survive. Inside, Clara moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this night 1,000 times. The vial disappeared into her bodice. The small bundle clothes papers, a single rosary, was already tied and ready. She slipped toward the back stairs as the front door creaked open. Mrs. Washington, the house's owner, met the intruders in her nightgown, eyes wide with carefully practiced confusion. Officers. At this hour, Deputy Marshal Franklin cut her off. "We're looking for a woman. Goes by Sarah Coleman. Negro. About 30. Small scar on her left hand." Behind him, 3 slave catchers waited, ropes dangling like promises. One of them, a tracker named Briggs, carried a sheaf of papers, handwriting samples compared and matched. He had followed the curl of a letter across 3 states, and now he believed he had her cornered. At the back door, Clara's hand met the cold metal latch just as 2 more men rounded the corner. Rain slicked their coats. Their eyes burned with the bounty's promise. The night held its breath. Would she drink the poison? Would she run? Or had the river of freedom at last reached its end? And so, dear listener, how do you think Clara's story ends? Does the hunter always catch the fox, or can a mother's love still outwit the world? Close your eyes and imagine the sound of those boots on wet wood and decide for yourself before sleep takes you. The alley was a dead end, a narrow throat of brick and shadow. Above her, boots thundered across the boarding house floors. Doors splintered. Voices barked orders. The other boarders, bless their silent courage, were buying her minutes, perhaps only a few, by pretending to know nothing. a community united in strategic ignorance. But Clara had survived 11 years of bondage by holding fast to a single bitter truth. Sometimes the only way out is straight through. Check every room, Deputy Franklin's command echoed down the stairwell, heavy as a death knell. Clara exhaled once, steady and slow. Then she did something no one expected. Instead of hiding, she stepped calmly into the hallway. A wash basin balanced in her hands, her head wrapped in a different colored cloth snatched from the laundry moments before. Her shoulders stooped into the weary curve of an older washerwoman. When Franklin nearly collided with her, she gasped and let the basin fall, dirty water splashing across his polished boots. "Oh Lord, sir, you near scared me half to death." Her voice carried a different cadence, a borrowed accent, roughened by exhaustion. "Just the washerwoman, sir. Come to fetch the early linens." Franklin squinted through the dim lamplight. The lye treatment that once lightened her skin had faded. Her natural color was returning, but fatigue had aged her features. The scar on her left hand, hidden beneath the dirty water, remained her most dangerous tell. "You seen any new boarders?" Franklin asked. "Woman about your height?" "No, sir," she replied, eyes lowered. "I keeps to the washing. Don't see much of nobody, except dirty clothes." He moved past her. But Briggs, the lead tracker, stopped. Something in her stillness betrayed a tension he recognized too well. "Let me see your hands," he said, voice low and sharp. The moment stretched, molten and dangerous. Clara raised her right hand, dripping with suds. "This one," Sir Both Briggs demanded. Upstairs a door slammed. A shout cracked the silence. Half a second of distraction, just enough. Clara flung the remaining water into Briggs's face and ran. She bolted for the front door skirts, snapping like startled birds. Dawn cracked the horizon, like an egg spilling pale yellow light across the wet cobblestones of Elm Street. "That's her, Briggs," roared blinking away soap. "That's the poisoner." Cincinnati streets were no Mississippi swamps. There were no cane fields to vanish into, no cypress shadows to swallow her whole. Boots and shouts multiplied behind her as the waking city stirred. Delivery wagons creaked to life. Dock workers lifted their heads, curious eyes widening at the sight of a black woman in house clothes pursued by armed men. She veered into an alley, leapt a fence, and crashed through a backyard where startled chickens exploded into a cloud of feathers and frantic clucks. Ahead, the Ohio River appeared between buildings, wide brown and indifferent. The border between slavery and the fragile theory of freedom. But crossing meant ferry tickets, documentation papers she no longer had. The chase funneled toward the waterfront, where morning fog unrolled from the river like ghosts escaping the night. Clara's breath burned her chest. The vial in her bodice thumped against her ribs with each stride. One swallow, and the story would end on her terms. But something stronger than fear drove her forward. The hope, no, the possibility that her daughters were waiting somewhere beyond that water, living the lives she had poisoned to give them. She burst onto the docks just as the sun breached the clouds. Steamboats loomed like slumbering giants. Dock workers paused mid-load, staring at the spectacle. A lone woman fleeing 7 armed men. Some stepped aside. Others hesitated too long, and Clara slipped past them in a blur of wet skirts and pounding feet. $500, to the man who brings her down, Franklin shouted. The mathematics of morality shifted instantly. Men who might have looked away now lunged forward, their eyes bright with sudden opportunity. Clara found herself herded toward the pier's edge, where the Ohio lapped against rotting wood. The river was swollen from September rains, its current swift enough to carry a body to the Mississippi without a trace. She turned to face them. 7 men formed a semicircle blocking every path. Briggs stepped forward, rope in hand. "It's over, Clara." Or should I say, Adoni. Her true name, spoken by men who had hunted her, felt like a violation. Her hand tightened around the vial, hidden in her bodice. "You know nothing of who I am," she said, her voice cutting through the river's roar. "We know you murdered 12 people," Franklin counted. "Poisoned them at their own table. Women, children." Clara laughed, a sound bitter as arsenic. "You want to speak of children?" Her words rose like a storm. "Where were your laws when my babies were sold? Where was your justice when I begged to say goodbye? That doesn't give you the right." Clara's voice climbed above the crowd. "You speak of rights, you who buy and sell human beings like cattle. You who tear mothers from daughters, wives from husbands. You who work us until we break and then sell the pieces." Behind the men, a crowd had gathered: free blacks, Irish dockhands, even a few well-dressed whites drawn by the noise. They watched this woman standing at the edge of everything, her words carrying truths most dared not speak aloud. "Whatever wrongs were done," Franklin said, struggling to regain control. "The law demands your law." Clara cut him off. She pulled the vial from her bodice, holding it high for all to see. "Your law says I am property, that my daughters were property, that our lives matter less than your comfort. I reject your law." The cork popped with a small final sound. Several men stepped forward, then froze as she raised the vial to her lips. "I have spent 11 years serving poison disguised as food," she declared. "Today, I choose my own feast." Wait, a new voice split the air. Dr. Webb pushed through the crowd, coat damp from the morning train. He carried the journal, the letters, the evidence of her mind. "Your daughters?" he said quickly. "Don't you want to know what happened to them?" Clara hesitated. The vial trembled in her hand. Webb stepped closer, speaking fast, urgent. "I traced them. After the Beauregards, after the Lancasters. They were sold, yes, but not separated. A Quaker family bought them together, took them to Canada. They are teachers now, Clara. Free women, educated, alive. You're lying." But her voice cracked with dangerous hope. "Grace has your careful hands," Webb continued softly. "Patience sings in the church choir. They use the names you gave them, not the ones their owners imposed. They're free, Clara. They're free because you survived long enough to give them that chance." The river murmured behind her, brown and endless. The crowd held its breath. The men with ropes loosened their grips, and Clara Adonai stood suspended between vengeance and the fragile miracle of mercy, the poison trembling like a final heartbeat in her hand. The crowd held its breath as if the morning itself feared to move. The Ohio River lapped against the pier, a slow and patient rhythm that had carried secrets far longer than any law. Above it, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last ribbons of fog until water and sky merged into a pale, endless shimmer. Clara stood there, between water and land, between death and capture, between the past that had made her and the future she would never see. Her eyes drifted toward the northern shore, toward a country called Canada, and two young women who might still remember their mother's face, her voice, the way her hands once guided theirs beneath the sheltering oak. Could they still hear her whisper? Could they still feel the warmth of a lesson, disguised as play? "If I drink this," Clara said softly, holding the small glass vial up to the morning light, "I die a free woman. If I surrender, I die a slave. Either way, I die. But only one way dies on my terms." The men who had hunted her tightened their circle. Deputy Franklin's knuckles whitened around his pistol. Behind him, the crowd thickened. Free black dock workers, curious Irish labourers, even a few well-dressed white onlookers drawn by the gravity of a woman defying an entire nation. Their silence pressed like a hand on the back of the world. Clara looked once more across the wide brown water to a freedom she might never touch, but could still imagine for her daughters. She looked at the men who claimed the right to capture her at the city that had almost swallowed her whole, and finally, at Dr. Webb, the only one among them who had tried to understand. "Tell them," she said quietly, but with a force that cut through the restless river wind. "Tell them their mother loved them enough to become a monster. Tell them their mother chose her own ending." Time slowed until even the river seemed to pause. The vial rose. Men lunged. The crowd surged forward. And in that single heartbeat of chaos, Clara made her choice. Not the poison, not surrender. The river. She turned and leapt. The Ohio opened its arms, brown and cold, swallowing her whole, like the earth itself swallowing a buried truth. Searchers dragged the water for hours, then days. The river gave nothing back. 3 bodies surfaced that September. 2 white men drowned in unrelated accidents and an elderly black woman from upriver. None were Clara. The Ohio kept its silence rolling toward the Mississippi with the stubborn love of a mother shielding her child. Some say drowning is the cruelest death. But those who have never been owned cannot know that drowning can happen in kitchens, too slowly, every day in the endless choke of obedience. Sheriff Donovan stood on the Cincinnati docks at sunset on October 1st, watching the search boats drag their nets through crimson water. Chains scraped through mud, echoing like distant memories of bondage. Local fishermen claimed the current could carry a body 20 miles in a single day, could wedge it beneath fallen trees or bury it deep in the shifting silt. "We need a body," Donovan muttered for the 100th time. No body, no proof. No proof, no justice. But what kind of justice, he wondered, hunts a mother across 3 states for avenging her stolen children? The question hung in the thick evening hour, unanswered, heavy as the humidity itself. Dr. Webb remained in Cincinnati officially to identify a corpse that never appeared. But in truth, his reasons had grown complicated. Weeks of studying Clara's journal had revealed a woman far more intricate than the headlines screaming "Monster Cook of Mississippi." She was no caricature of evil. She was an architect of careful revenge, a mother carved hollow by laws, a chemist who turned the cruel science of the kitchen into quiet rebellion. From his private notes dated October 2nd, 1847, the river police claim no woman could survive that current. But Clara survived 11 years of calculating dosages while feigning ignorance. Survival was her art. He visited the boarding house where Clara, under the name Sarah Coleman, had once lived. Residents remembered nothing. Mrs. Washington denied everything with a practiced calm born from years of protecting the endangered. But Webb's sharp eyes noticed a loose floorboard in Clara's rented room. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment, $37, a train schedule to Canada, and a half-finished letter in that unmistakable curling hand. "My dearest daughters," it began. "If you remember your mother at all, the river had stolen that reunion. Or perhaps not. On October 7th, a farmer 40 miles downstream reported his skiff missing and fresh clothes gone from his wife's morning wash. His wife swore she'd glimpsed a lone figure moving carefully along the riverbank at dawn, too far to identify, but walking with the deliberate favor of someone guarding a weak left shoulder. The local sheriff dismissed it as a wandering vagrant. Webb, remembering a journal entry about Clara's childhood injury and the ache it left in cold weather, filed the story away with a quiet certainty he never voiced. Never. Back in Mississippi, the Whitmore plantation was sold at auction. Its 47 enslaved people were scattered to distant buyers. Their fortress of silence shattered by distance. Ruth, still unbroken, found herself on a plantation near Jackson, where she began again teaching letters in secret beneath moonlight. Clara's lessons surviving like seeds scattered on stubborn soil. Old Moses died that winter, carrying his memories into a softer earth than any he had ever tilled. The great poisoning changed everything and nothing. Kitchens across the South became places of suspicion. Planters issued new rules. No slave could prepare food unsupervised. No one could purchase certain supplies. No container could be trusted. But no rule could erase the deeper fear that the supposedly powerless had power. After all, that every meal might whisper a quiet threat. Patterson, the cruel overseer, who had once ruled Whitmore with calculated terror, lasted only 2 months at his next posting, before dying of sudden dysentery. The symptoms could have been natural, or not. Among the enslaved, no one was surprised. Clara had taught more than letters beneath that oak tree. She had taught them that knowledge is a slow poison patient and unstoppable. And in Cincinnati, as autumn turned the riverbanks to gold and russet, the Ohio rolled on brown, endless and silent. Perhaps somewhere far to the north, a woman with careful hands and a crooked left shoulder stepped ashore, carrying a name no law could cage and a love fierce enough to rewrite the very rules of survival. The search was finally called off. The official papers declared Clara dead, drowned in the brown sweep of the Ohio River. But in Bucktown, the small street and shadowed markets refused to accept the ending that law demanded. Stories began to circulate, whispered in church pews, and traded softly over baskets of collard greens. A woman seen at dawn gathering herbs along the riverbank. A familiar face glimpsed on a northbound train. An envelope of money left in secret for families hiding runaways, always the same curious amount, $37. 37. The number lingered like a code, as if each gift carried the quiet echo of Whitmore Plantation, and the lives Clara had altered forever. That November, Dr. Webb followed the trail north to Ontario, traveling at his own expense, driven by a curiosity that had begun to feel suspiciously like devotion. There, in a small farming community, he found two young women, Grace 19 and Patience 21, running a modest school for black children. They had taken the surname Freeman, shedding the chains of their past, except in the careful way they held their shoulders and the watchfulness in their eyes, a habit of survival that no border could wash away. We heard about the poisonings Grace said when Webb introduced himself. Her hands so uncannily, like Clara's, folded neatly in her lap. They say our mother did it. What do you remember of her, Webb asked, though his heart already knew the answer. Patience spoke first, her voice soft as river mist. Hands that could be gentle with cornbread and cruel with necessity. A voice that sang us to sleep with songs from her mother's mother. Eyes that went somewhere else whenever the master called her away. Grace added, she taught us to read using flour on the kitchen table. Said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't sell. Webb opened Clara's journal and showed them a few carefully chosen pages. The sisters read in silence, their faces carved from stone, revealing nothing. But that night, neighbors reported hearing singing from their house old songs, in a language older than English, melodies of mourning and celebration woven together like strands of smoke. The truth settled like fog over the river. Clara had poisoned 12 people across 5 calculated years, perhaps more. She had traced her daughters through whispers and ledgers. She had built a network of forged papers and hidden allies. And then she had stepped into the Ohio at the very instant capture seemed certain. Bodies sink in muddy water. But sometimes they also swim. By December, sightings arrived from places far beyond Cincinnati. Detroit, Chicago, even Boston. A woman fitting her description working in a hotel kitchen. A letter, written in that unmistakable curling hand, reaching the desk of an abolitionist. Donations arriving in precise amounts, $37, 12.5. 37 for the Whitmore dead. 12 for the years she had planned. 5 for the year she vanished. On December 22nd, 1847, Sheriff Donovan filed his final report. Clara, Negro woman, cook, deceased by drowning while fleeing arrest for murder. Case closed. Justice served. But Dr. Webb could not close his own ledger. His professional curiosity had transformed into something more complicated. Part admiration, part unease. He began tracing the pattern of these ghostly appearances. Always northward, always near water. In small towns along rivers and lakes, he found records of medicinal poison purchases, tiny amounts, harmless unless you knew exactly what to look for. The trail was faint but deliberate, like footsteps muffled in fresh snow. On Christmas Eve, Webb returned to his hotel to find an unmarked envelope. Inside lay a single pressed magnolia blossom, snow-white, impossibly fragrant, a flower that did not grow this far north. No words, no signature, just that flower carrying the quiet perfume of Mississippi. A message written in the language of the deliberately alive. Webb burned the letter and the flower that night, watching evidence curl into smoke. Some truths, he decided, are better drowned than documented. He returned to Mississippi after the new year, resumed his medical practice, and never spoke Clara's name in public again. But her journal remained hidden in his medical bag. On sleepless nights, he would take it out, running a finger over the pages that described how to prepare a poison, how to balance healing and harm. The same hands that comforted, he realized, could also kill. The same knowledge that saved could destroy. Meanwhile, the Ohio River rolled on, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And somewhere in the spaces between history and legend, in Ontario, in Chicago, perhaps in every city that smells faintly of river mud, a woman who might or might not be, Clara kept moving. Free, alive, unrepentant. The Ohio never gave up her body. But then rivers know how to keep the stories that matter most. 20 years later, in a Chicago boarding house kitchen, an elderly black woman trained new cooks with particular care. Remember, she would say, stirring soup with a slow, practiced grace, the right seasoning is everything. Some swore they caught a trace of magnolia in the steam. Some said her left shoulder seemed to ache when the winter turned cold. And some, listening carefully, thought they heard a faint melody, an old river song rising from her lips, carrying the quiet promise of a mother who had outwitted both the law and death itself. The Whitmore case reminds us that some dinners never really end. The plates are cleared, the house is gone, yet the air still tastes faintly of magnolia and metal. And if you lean close enough, you can almost hear Clara's whisper knowledge is power, and power changes everything. But the river does not keep all its secrets. Our next story drifts even deeper into the dark, where vengeance takes a shape no court could ever name, and where the cost of freedom is counted, not in coins, but in lives. Stay with me. The night is long, and history still has one more secret to share.